I'm reading from the Gospel of Matthew chapter 8, verses 5 to 17. When Jesus had entered Capernaum, a centurion came up to him asking for help. "Lord," he said, "my servant lies at home, paralyzed, suffering terribly." Jesus said to him, "Shall I come and heal him?" And the centurion replied, "Lord, I don't deserve to have you come under my roof, but just say the word, and my servant will be healed. For I myself am a man under authority, with soldiers under me. I tell this one, 'Go,' and he goes, and that one, 'Come,' and he comes. I say to my servant, 'Do this,' and he does it." When Jesus heard this, he was amazed and said to those following him, "Truly, I tell you, I've not found anyone in Israel with such great faith. I say to you that many will come from the east and the west and will take their places at the feast with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. But the subjects of the kingdom will be thrown outside into the darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." Then Jesus said to the centurion, "Go, let it be done just as you believed it would." And his servant was healed at that moment. When Jesus came into Peter's house, he saw Peter's mother-in-law lying in bed with a fever. He touched her hand, and the fever left her, and she got up and began to wait on him. When evening came, many who were demon-possessed were brought to him, and he drove out the spirits with a word and healed all who were ill. This was to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet Isaiah. He took up our infirmities and bore our diseases. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
1 Peter 3, verses 1 to 9. Wives, in the same way, submit yourselves to your own husbands, so that, if any of them do not believe the word, they may be won over without words by the behavior of their wives, when they see the purity and reverence of your lives. Your beauty should not come from outward adornment, such as elaborate hairstyles and the wearing of gold jewelry or fine clothes. Rather, it should be that of your inner self, the unfading beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is of great worth in God's sight. For this is the way the holy women of the past, who put their hope in God, used to adorn themselves. They submitted themselves to their own husbands, like Sarah, who obeyed Abraham and called him her Lord. You are her daughters, if you do what is right and do not give way to fear. Husbands, in the same way, be considerate as you live with your wives, and treat them with respect as the weaker partner and as heirs with you of the gracious gift of life, so that nothing will hinder your prayers. Finally, all of you, be like-minded, be sympathetic, love one another, be compassionate and humble. Do not repay evil with evil or insult with insult. On the contrary, repay evil with blessing, because to this you were called, so that you may inherit a blessing.
Last week, when we were looking at the Bible, there were some implicit things for us to say about sexuality and gender. Today, there are some more explicit things to say. It is interesting that Abbi, who has very recently been married, gets to read a passage about wives and husbands. So I'll be looking at that as well as something for the broader congregation. If you don't have a Bible and you want one, there is one at the back on the entrance, and also I think a Pioneer Ninoshka there. So please do pick one up if you need one. There are two very famous passages in the New Testament of the Bible about the relationship between wives and husbands. One is here in 1 Peter and one is in Ephesians. Now, as these matters sometimes drop, that at our Bible study on Wednesdays we are looking at Ephesians, and on Sundays at the moment we are looking at 1 Peter. So there is no way to avoid this momentous subject. But what I want to say to you is it doesn't say what you might think it says. It is interesting that sometimes the chapter divisions in the Bible are a blessing in helping us to find passages and so on. And sometimes the verse numbers in the Bible are a blessing in helping us to be able to quote certain verses, although it does rather lead to quoting them out of context, I always think. And sometimes the way that the editors of a particular Bible divide the passages is interesting in revealing their own opinions, because they have a tendency to put the divisions where they want. The important thing for us to remember is that the chapter numbers and the verse numbers and the editorial subdivisions are not original to the Bible. They were added by scribes and copyists in order to help us find our way around them, but they're not there in the original Greek New Testament. And so therefore, when we look at this, we start a new chapter, chapter 3. But if we remove that chapter number, what Peter has been saying in chapter 2 follows on into what he says to wives. And who is he talking about at the end of chapter 2? He is talking about Jesus. And when he speaks to wives, he says, in the same way. Jesus has given us an example of how we ought to live. Wives are to learn from that example. The rather sad thing, if you're a man, particularly a married man, is that a few verses later it says, husbands in the same way. So we men are also to follow Jesus' example. And we also need to note very clearly that whatever Peter is saying here refers wives to how they treat their own husbands, and husbands to how they treat their own wives. What it does not make in any sense is a male hierarchy with women as second-class citizens. That is so far away from the intent of the Bible. Now, it is interesting when we look at Ephesians, as we shall be doing in our Bible study, not too long away from now. One of the words that is emphasized in Ephesians in the way that preachers handle it is the word submit. But there it says that husbands are also to submit to their wives. But the way that the chapter divisions are put in place and the editorial comment puts the emphasis on what wives must do rather than husbands must do. Again, where here it says wives in the same way submit, it says husbands in the same way too. And when it talks about Jesus in the preceding chapter, it talks about how he behaved when wrong was done to him. Now, husbands who are here, and I think I'm right in saying that there are more single people here than there are married people, or round about half, I think, I don't know. We need to note that our goal is not to mistreat our wives ever. And so, therefore, the opportunities for wives to submit in the way that the passage talks about are to be very limited indeed. You know, sometimes in a household, perhaps there are those households where there is the regard that women are always the second-class person, and therefore the will of the husband is the one that carries the day. It is far more biblical and in line with this passage that when there is a subject that comes up that is a matter of discussion and maybe even disagreement or debate. I mean, far be it that there'd ever be that in a Christian household, but trust me, unless your marriage is better than my marriage, it does happen. The extent of what the passage here says is that wives may sometimes have to give ground, and ultimately where it's going to turn into an argument that runs several days, then there is to be consideration given to that. But even then, in this balancing and juggling game, it says here that husbands are to be considerate. So maybe ultimately it is the husband who is to give ground. What this doesn't give is any hard and fast rule for every situation. There are, however, some things here that even a Bible teacher trying to properly understand can not argue away. It talks about a wife dressing modestly. You know, I do marriage preparation classes for those who are to be married. And one of the things I say to the lady, and to some degree to the man, is that before you have a partner in life, you dress to impress. But after you are married, you still dress to impress, but you just simply dress to impress one person rather than everybody in the pub. Not that being godly types you would ever go there anyway, but you know what I mean. But it does also mean that perhaps in some of the contemporary fashion trends of every generation, we are to choose wisely. Says here that wives are to eschew the wearing of gold jewelry. This also obviously works for husbands as well. I've given up the business of wearing gold jewelry. I only wear silver these days, so it is, I'm sure that's not what it means, but hey ho. But also, The wives here are told, and this is pertinent, that if they are married to someone who is not of the faith, their lifestyle and prayer style is to be of a manner that draws their husbands towards the faith rather than drives them away from the faith. And he compares here the example of Abraham and Sarah. And just to note that when it says that Sarah called Abraham her Lord, that is a term in the Old Testament times that would have meant the head of the household, which is still somewhat un-21st century, but it is not Lord in the sense of God or Master or any of that. There is only one God who made heaven and earth and all that is in them. And the husbands here, and I count myself in this number, are those who are to do nothing that will hinder their prayers. Now, there are two ways in which prayers are hindered. Firstly, we perhaps pray sometimes with a guilty conscience. Consciences are a funny thing. You know, we have been raised with the legend of Pinocchio, that very biblical story, oft confused with the story of Jonah, in that both involve a large fish or mammal in the case of Pinocchio's story. And many of us will remember, and I'm sure I've mentioned this before, in the Walt Disney film version of Pinocchio, that pesky little mite, Jiminy Cricket, who sings such great classics as Give a Little Whistle and, most importantly, always let your conscience be your guide. But the Bible tells us that as individuals, we're pretty messed up people. And if we are messed up, then our conscience is messed up too. And sometimes we end up feeling guilty about things that we are not guilty of. And so, don't let our consciences put us off praying, whether it appears to us in a little form of a little insect with a top hat and tailcoat or not. But the other way, and perhaps more importantly, is that if we carry wrongdoing in our lives, the likelihood of God answering our prayers is hindered. And when you get married, then as well as your own life being right, you become involved in the fact that your partner's life must be right. You are truly a team. You know? We must always remember that other very important saying that there is no I in team. But if you look at team very closely, there is me in there. It's just spelt backwards. So it is very easy for a team not to be a team and to be a self-centered thing where we take all of the glory. But whether you are married or whether you are single, this passage has a huge amount to say to you. And this is why I didn't end our passage today at verse 7 because being aware that there are single people in the room. Verse 8 and verse 9 says, all of you. We are to be like-minded. Now this is interesting because we are very different people. I'm not like Ninoshka. Pat is not like Ola. Jenny is not like Abby, and so on and so forth. But we are to be like-minded when it comes to our primary purpose, which is the business of serving God. We are to be sympathetic. Now, we may not understand the other person's situation, but we are to take a part in it. We're told to be like Jesus. And one of the things about Jesus is that he came into the world to carry burden for others. Now, we are not Jesus. The church had a saying a few years ago, which was a horrible thing, that said we are to be Jesus for our generation. Nonsense. We are not Jesus. We cannot fulfill his primary roles in dying at Calvary. But we are instructed to be like him. And therefore we are to carry one another's burdens. We are to be sympathetic. But we cannot be sympathetic unless the other person shares. Unless the other person tells what is wrong. Now, it is not always possible to do that because sometimes there is a degree of confidentiality. And that applies in the lives of doctors and pastors and hospital workers and all kinds of people. But then there are other things that can be shared. And you don't have to stumble on somebody in a corner crying to know that something is wrong. We are to be compassionate. And we are to be humble. We are not to think of ourselves more highly than we ought to do. This is what it means to be humble. We are to be those who realize, in what I was saying before communion, that when it comes to our relationship with God, we are not fit for purpose. It is only because of his grace and mercy that we are in this relationship with God. And one of the greatest enemies of Christianity is self-righteousness, prejudice, and judgmentalism. Woe betide us if we become like that. And one of the harder things here is that it says we are not to repay evil with evil or insult with insult. On the contrary, repay evil with blessing, because to this you were called, so that you may inherit a blessing. The New Testament is riddled with promises of blessing for those who follow God in their style of life. Primarily in the Sermon on the Mount, in what we call the Beatitudes sometimes, Blessed are the peacemakers. And all of those other categories of people who are blessed. And this is so hard, it almost makes me want to scream. Scream in my inner person because of how often I fail to do this. Do not repay evil with evil or insult with insult. How many times does somebody say something to you that you know is not true, and you catch yourself and try to avoid saying the bad thing in return? But you realize that that bad thing is already in your heart. So whether you let it out or not, you have to deal with it. And it doesn't say here, on the contrary, repay evil with silence. It says, repay evil with blessing. And that is so hard. Not giving like for like, or like for biting your tongue, or like for counting to 100 and hoping the anger goes away, but like for kindness, in order that you too, on the day that you stand before God, on the day when our wonder, our transport, our worship, our rapture finally come, and we receive all the blessings that are not our due, but our blessings that we don't really understand why we're getting them. On that day, we will not receive judgment, we will receive blessing. So, if you're married, good luck. If you're single, that's not much better, because the married thing is tough, but it's usually not lonely. Single is also tough, but it can be lonely. The worst thing is to be married and in a bad relationship, and then you feel all the difficulties and the loneliness as well. But whatever kind of relationship you are in, when you're being like-minded and sympathetic and loving one another and being compassionate and humble, talk to God about it, because this is going to be a battle. I figured in my life that the longer I lived, the less of a battle it would be. And now, as I stand here, age 28, I realize that the battle just seems to go on. The struggles and the way that I fail myself and fail God. But thank God we have the scriptures to tell us how we should live and to set our goals for us. And then when we face the important moment, we will not just be taking a penalty, but we will reach our goal.